A free society requires an independent press. Turbulent, inquiring, bustling and free. Often I have cause to celebrate editorial endeavour. Occasionally I have had cause for regret. But let me be clear, we will vigorously pursue the truth and we will not tolerate wrongdoing.
News Corporation Chair and CEO Rupert Murdoch speaking in London last year. Hello and welcome to Media7. This week, the British Parliament's Home Affairs Committee delivered a report declaring as fact that Murdoch's company deliberately blocked a criminal investigation into phone hacking at the News of the World. The phone hacking scandal, like many great stories, took years to truly bear fruit, but when it did, things happened very quickly. Arrests, resignations, recriminations, corporate rumblings, and the death of a whistleblower. Jose Barbosa explains that relations between British Prime Ministers and their press barons go a long way back.
For well over a century now, Britain's political elite have been entangled in something of an abusive codependency. Prime Ministers need the benediction of the press, so the average punter remains unaware that the person making decisions for them is a bit of a nong. And the most feared creature of all is the person who owns and runs the papers. Take the example of Lord Northcliffe, who made his fortune starting the Daily Mail and the Mirror. Brits read those papers in their millions, so when Northcliffe decided that the then Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, was absolutely useless, he had the perfect instruments to enact change. The Northcliffe papers incessantly reported that so rubbish was the ammunition used by troops fighting the Hun that the only possible less effective method of warfare would be to try and bring about the end of World War I through the power of dance. The scandal brought down the government and Asquith eventually resigned. But his legacy lives on in this street in Auckland, which many people use every day to go to this garden centre, which has new season deals on pre-seeded garden mats. The press barons have been many and their influence great, but the world's never seen anything quite like Rupert Murdoch. So important is the power he wields through his newspaper and television holdings that Tony Blair famously courted the bobble-headed Australian in his quest to become Prime Minister.
He said, Piers, look, he said, let me explain to you exactly what my view of Murdoch is. He said, it's better to be riding the tiger's back than having it ripping your throat out.
Back in the 80s, he'd almost single-handedly broken up the powerful print unions by moving the News Limited headquarters from Fleet Street to Wapping. But that was only after he'd got Margaret Thatcher's assurance that enough police would be on hand to protect non-union workers bust in to man the presses. That's how Murdoch has operated, with few in power willing to risk phlebotomy by speaking against him, until now.
It's like an entire immune system going into violent reaction.
Detectives reveal they've identified 4,000 people who may have been targeted by the tabloid.
US senators are now on his case following the allegation that 9/11 victims and their families' phones were hacked.
We politicians, all of us, failed to recognise that Rupert Murdoch had just got too powerful.
The Murdoch-owned News of the World has seemed like Pandora's box, the most vile revelation being that reporters for the paper hacked the voicemail messages of a murdered 13-year-old girl. The News of the World was suddenly no more.
No one's called for the News of the World to be closed. Present staff are not associated with this. In fact, James Murdoch's statement pays tribute to them, says that what great journalism they're doing, so it seems perverse to be closing down the newspaper.
Couple those lost jobs with the current 24-hour turnover at News Corp and high-profile police resignations, and at this rate, there'll be no one left in London. But as the flames creep towards B-Sky Beast CEO James Murdoch and his pot, Fox News is doing its best to shoo people away from the burning building.
You know, you look at some sites, you would think that Martians had landed in New Jersey again. We've got some serious problems in this country right now. We are teetering on default. And what do? They talk about this.
Meanwhile, the story took a tragic turn.
The former News of the World entertainment reporter was found dead at his home. It was he who'd gone public about phone hacking to the BBC earlier this year.
It was endemic. You know, it happened.
And the Murdochs and their former chief executive were dragged before the House of Commons.
Immediately, his wife, Wendy Deng, stood up and slapped the protester on the head.
But no matter what happens to the dirty digger and his empire, reform of the UK press may be a foregone conclusion.
It's undermined journalism itself. And if what comes out of this is a proper regulatory framework where we actually have the kind of regulation that you have in broadcasting now on the print press, I actually think it would be a good outcome.
Jose Barbosa there, and Wendy Deng. Now, last November, I spoke to former Melbourne Herald Sun editor Bruce Guthrie. He's author of Man Bites Murdoch, his account of a spectacular falling out with the Murdoch newspaper empire. We have a new interview with him in a moment, but first, this is what he said back then.
One of the things about News Limited is that it's very outcomes driven. It's not really big on process, you know, and if you don't do the processes right, you can end up with things coming back to bite you. So hence, we now have News Limited defending a phone hacking scandal in Britain. We now have News Limited defending the Melbourne Storm salary cap rorting in Melbourne. And you have, you know, my dismissal and court case, which, you know, I would argue was the result of bad processes. So I think, you know, the end doesn't always justify the means, and News Limited would do well to pay perhaps a little bit more attention to process and a little less attention to outcomes.
Well, that was then, this is now. Bruce Guthrie, do you feel vindicated or just prescient?
Look, I'll accept either of those, Russell. Look, I think that News Corp ignored a lot of warnings. I think there's been problems at the company for some time, both in Britain, in Australia and in the United States, but I think its problem was its kind of overweening arrogance, if you like, and if it had listened more rather than and talked a little less, perhaps it wouldn't be in this position now.
Would there have been some reckoning sometime, even without the phone hacking scandal?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, it was going along pretty well. I mean, and I don't think politicians had a will to pull up the organisation, if you like. Politicians have been beating a path to the door of Rupert Murdoch, you know, for decades now, both in Australia and in Britain and in the United States. So I think it was going to take something seismic, and this is truly seismic, for that to stop. But I think there are signs now that has stopped.
We've seen stories speculating on the disputes within the Murdoch family, particularly with Elizabeth. Will this lead to even more unhappiness within the family itself?
Look, I think it could. I think there are two reasons for this. I think that, you know, we're veering into personal lives here, but I think it's fairly well known within the company and indeed in media circles that when Rupert Murdoch's marriage to Anna broke up, and then soon after or later he married Wendy Deng, that obviously put friction on the family, as it would any family. I mean, at the end of the day, the Murdochs are just like any other family. And I think that the breakdown of that marriage caused a great deal of internal tension and friction, which is probably manifesting itself a little bit now in how the company's run. And the best experts seem to suggest that there are divisions with the family as to what the way forward is. And we wait and see as to who steps up, if you like, to take the reins if, as we suspect, James is now mortally wounded.
Are we seeing here the downside of Murdoch's dynastic approach to running his company?
Undoubtedly. I mean, having worked at the company in a couple of stints, and most recently for 5 years up until a couple of years ago, more than any company that I've ever worked for or I'm familiar with, it is very much one man's worldview, which kind of permeates down across the entire company. And once again, that can be a good thing. I think newspapers can sometimes benefit from having a strong proprietor. But as Rupert Murdoch's empire has gotten bigger and bigger, he inevitably has become more and more detached. You know, he's now 80 years of age. You know, I think that even if this hadn't have happened, there would have been people saying that perhaps his time's up. And of course, that will now grow into a genuine chorus.
Why was it not obvious to Murdoch that he couldn't get away with leaving Rebekah Brooks in her job? What does that say about his instincts?
Well, one of the interesting things about News Limited is that even though it plays an extraordinary role in shaping public opinion around the world, really, it doesn't react to public opinion when it's against that company. And that's because of an extraordinary arrogance. If you control 70% of the Australian newspaper market and 40% of the British newspaper market and significant percentage of the American television market. It doesn't really matter what public opinion says. You can turn it, you can reshape it. You can almost invent your own reality. And I think what happened here is that probably initially at least, and actually for an extended period, a lot of the most senior Murdoch executives and Murdoch family members probably thought that at any point they could turn back the tide. But of course they can't, because it became so big that it was irresistible, and they've kind of been drowned in it. And I think, again, it comes down to hubris.
Do you feel a little sympathy there, the great newspaper man losing his papers?
Look, he's achieved great things in his lifetime, and in a sense it would be a little sad if this is his legacy. But having said that, I mean, the culture is his culture. It all starts from Rupert Murdoch, and it's a whatever it takes culture. Get the story, put the story on page one, let's sell lots of newspapers, and let's not worry too much about how we got those stories. And whatever you do, don't get caught. And they got caught. So in that sense, my sympathy is limited.
Former Melbourne Herald Sun editor and author of Man Bites Murdoch, Bruce Guthrie. After the break, Barry Coleman and Bernard Hickey wonder where next for the family firm.